There's a joke about a rabbi who went to interview for a job at a new synagogue. And in preparation for his sermon, he asked the shul president, "Do you mind if I run some ideas by you?" And the president says, "Sure, of course." He says, "I was thinking about talking about the importance of the mitzvah of kashrut, keeping kosher." And the president says, "Rabbi, I don't know. A lot of our members, they're not so strict about kashrut, about keeping kosher. You might alienate some of them. You might want to pick something else." So Rabbi thinks it's not a problem, not a problem. I know. I will talk about the mitzvah of Shabbat, the commandment of keeping the holy Sabbath. It's the most important thing there is. And again, the president says to me, "Rabbi," he makes that face. I don't know if that's the right topic either. A lot of our members aren't so strict about keeping Shabbat. You might want to pick something else. So Rabbi thinks for a moment, and he thinks for a moment, and then he says to the president, "If I can't talk about Shabbat, I can't talk about kashrut, what's left to talk about?" To which the president replies, "Judaism." This joke was on my mind a bit because today feels like a bit of an interview, if I'm being honest. I've had the pleasure of meeting many of you on Shabbat mornings or at a shul event. Some of you I've met in my office planning a simcha, or we've spoken on the phone. Some of you I've met in your homes for a cup of coffee. Some of you I've met to celebrate good times, and some of you I've met, sadly, because you are facing something difficult in your life. But despite those of you I've met, for many of us, today's our first meeting. So I'm not going to use this meeting to pontificate on the importance of keeping Shabbat or keeping kashrut. I do think they're important. But I want to share with you a bit about myself. Why I became a rabbi, what my vision of a rabbinate is, and what some of my vision for what we can accomplish here at Beth Torah in the new year is. So before I talk about a vision of the future, it's important to ask, what is the issue? What are we trying to do? There was a point where the conservative movement was the largest denomination in North America, by far. By far. Solomon Schechter, one of the founders, really the mind behind conservative Judaism on this side of the Atlantic, once said that the Orthodox and the Reform would never constitute anything but mere minorities. He wasn't worried about them at all. That's how strong conservative Judaism was once on these shores. Just a little over 100 years after his death, lots changed. The Reform and conservative movement, the conservative movement is no longer the largest movement in North America, still the largest in Canada, but it's shrinking. The Reform movement has become the largest in the United States, but also it's shrinking. The Orthodox world is slowly growing, and while some might attribute the success and growth of the Orthodox to the fact that they think conservative Reform Jews are leaving to go become Orthodox, the data is actually very clear on this. Our next generations aren't leaving in general to become Orthodox. There are people that do that. But many of them are simply leaving. They're leaving Judaism. The largest denomination that's growing in the Jewish world are the nuns. N-O-N-E-S. People who are born with a Jewish parent, people who are raised in a Jewish home, and when asked today what their religion is, their answer is none. There are more than a third of Jews under the age of 50. I'm not talking about something that's happening with adolescents or 20-year-olds. Under the age of 50 is a third of the Jewish world, are people who grew up in the Reform conservative, some even in the Orthodox world. They identify ethnically and culturally as Jewish, but when they're asked what their religion is, the answer is none. So as the conservative movement struggles with this demographic crisis of what to do in the future, as synagogues, the movement that once had more synagogues than any other in North America, closes down sanctuaries that have sat empty, as synagogues merge to figure out what to do when they cannot fill their halls, after the last few years of the pandemic, when so many synagogues and other Jewish institutions have suffered, there's a lot of work to be done ahead if we're going to change this tide, if we're going to change the impact and the future of conservative Judaism. And one of the major issues I think that there are is that oftentimes the rabbis, the leaders, the heads of the various Jewish communal institutions, I think, are asking the wrong questions. As the rate of assimilation increases, those who are trying to address it usually sit around boardrooms, committee meetings, rabbinic gatherings, and they look back on their own Jewish experience, the things that they valued, and they complain. Why don't younger Jews value this? Why doesn't the next generation value what we valued? Whether it's said explicitly or not, what they're saying is, what's wrong with this next generation of Jews? And the problem is that these leaders are asking the wrong question. Instead of asking what is wrong with those who don't want to come, the question is, what's wrong with our organizations? Why aren't they full like they once were? The joke I began with is not really so much of a joke when you dissect it. It's the problem. The rabbi in that joke thinks that once you take out kashrut and Shabbat, there's nothing left to talk about at Judaism. Our entire tradition, thousands of years, is boiled down to these ritual mitzvot. But the president in that joke, he understands there is much more to Judaism than that. And that's the problem. That's the kind of joke that's told by rabbis who don't understand what their role is. It's the kind of joke that those who are frustrated by their congregations or their boards, because they're not interested in the same aspects of Judaism that they're interested in, that they tell. I don't think we should be surprised that when the Judaism being offered to many people by many institutions is disconnected from the lives those people lead, that so many of them are disconnected from Judaism. The Judaism they've been offered, sadly, for many people, doesn't have much to offer them. And I want to be clear here. I'm not saying that mitzvah observance, tradition isn't important. It is. It's so wonderful to be here after the last 2 years of virtual services, reciting the words from our Machzor, blowing the shofar, celebrating together as a community, upholding these traditions. But there's more than just the traditions. There's more than just the rituals. There are more than just the mitzvot, like Shabbat and Kashrut. And that's why I think conservative Judaism at one point was so successful. The founders weren't rooted just in the past. They built a Judaism that was based on looking towards the present and the future. It was a middle ground, a space which can offer the riches of our shared heritage in a modern world. A Judaism rooted in the wisdom of the past, passed down from generation to generation. A synagogue that can engage people's spirits, rituals that can awaken our souls. A Judaism that doesn't ask someone to give up modernity for tradition, but where the two coexist. Each lifts up the other. A Judaism that lifts us up for the tomorrow, connects us to the past. Again, our theme this year is renewal. And that's part of my goal and part of my vision and my hope. This community was built by a group of people who decided it was important to have a synagogue here in this neighborhood. By a group of people who took money out of their pocket to help put down and come up with the money needed in order to buy a plot of land, to build on it. A community that looked towards the future. Those founding members laid a strong foundation. And over the last 60 years, that foundation's only gotten stronger. This is a synagogue that's known for experimentation. It's a synagogue and a community that's known for being a place for those who don't find a home in other institutions. And that's a tradition that I hope to continue. There's another joke about a rabbi who goes to a new synagogue and is confused. When people walk up to the bima for an aliyah to the Torah, about halfway down the aisle, they stop and they bow. He's never seen that before. So he asks around the different members, why do you bow there? I don't know that custom. I've looked in my books. I've looked in the Talmud. I can't find that custom. And each member says, I don't know. It's just what I've seen others doing. And they ask and they ask and they ask. So finally they find one of the older members, the oldest in the community, one of the few remaining members from the early days. And they ask him about the tradition. And he says, when they first started, they were davening in so-and-so's basement, and there was a pipe that went across. So you had to dump. And it became a tradition. That's what we do in the Jewish world. Something's done once, it's done twice, it's done a few times. It very quickly becomes a tradition. It becomes the only way to do something. We focus a lot on preservation. But there are rabbis, I think, who've forgotten what their job is. They think that their job is preservation alone. You can go to the Royal Ontario Museum, and you can see there and walk through exhibits of ancient cultures, preserved behind glass, objects that people no longer touch, books that people don't read, traditions that, like those who once practiced them, are no longer living. It's always unnerving for me when I go to the Ram and I see the Judaica exhibit. Because I walk through that exhibit and I see a tradition that I know is living. I'm living it, but up there with the others. Behind a glass case, you can see Kiddush cups. You can see Seder plates, tzedakah boxes, Purim groggers, a Torah scroll locked behind a glass case. And I find it unnerving because when I go there, I fear that one day that might be our future. That might be where Judaism is preserved. Not in the hearts of Jews, but in a museum. And I fear that many institutions and our leaders have decided or think that their job is to be like museum curator, to preserve what's been done simply because it's been done. Like the community that bows halfway up the aisle is in the old building. There used to be a pipe there. But is that what rabbis have always done? Has being a rabbi always been about preservation alone? I don't think so. I could be wrong, but I don't think I am, because for 2,000 years, rabbis have been doing something different than preservation for the sake of preservation alone. There's a halacha in the Talmud that when your teacher walks by, you're supposed to stand and rise before them out of honor and respect. So the Talmud tells us the Rabbi Zera and Abaye, two of the great sages of their generation, when they were walking, they saw one of their students sitting ahead, they would go the long way around them so they could avoid them and not force them to stand. They chose to trouble themselves rather than the members of their community. They understood that a rabbi's job is to make halachic observance easier, not more burdensome. We celebrate Sukkot in a few weeks, and we shake the lulav. The rabbis in the Talmud weren't sure what plant was supposed to be used. One of them suggests a certain plant, and it's quickly dismissed because it has thorns on it. And the other rabbis all agree. The Torah, God, would never have commanded us to do anything that would be difficult or painful. And yet today there are many rabbis who allow Judaism and halakha, even if it doesn't cause physical pain, they let it cause emotional pain to people who are marginalized in our communities, whose voices have not been expressed in our institutions and in our sanctuaries. And that emotional pain, I think, is a lot worse than a prick on one's finger. There's a tradition that if it's raining and you can't eat your meal in the sukkah, the established halakha for more than 1,000 years is that you should wait until at least midnight before giving up hope and going in to eat, hoping that maybe by midnight the rain will stop. But the Chofetz Chaim, the founder of the Musar movement, and one of the most important and influential halachic rabbinic authorities of the last century, he added a caveat. Unless it's troublesome for you, unless it's burdensome for you, if it's difficult because you're hungry or you're tired and you want to eat your meal, eat inside, he says. But today we have a problem. Today we've been presenting Judaism as one-sided since the law codes were written. We've been presenting it as if there's one right answer and not different ones. We've been presenting it as if there's one answer that hasn't changed, that was passed down from Moses at Mount Sinai. But the truth is, the rabbis in each generation have changed and adapted, have helped guide their communities to bring them closer to Torah and to our traditions, to bring them closer to practice, to make sure that observance and connection is something that's meaningful for them. I don't think we should change traditions just for the sake of changing traditions. If bowing as you walk down the aisle to the Aliyah doesn't hurt anybody, people find meaning in that connection, of course it should be something that is kept. But we have many traditions that make Jewish life burdensome and difficult. Sometimes truly painful for people. And we have to ask ourselves a question. What is our goal? What is the purpose of a rabbi? What is the purpose of a synagogue? Is the rabbi's job to be a curator at a museum to preserve something simply for the sake of preservation? To let it live locked behind glass windows and cases for future people who don't observe it and don't live it to see and learn about as something from the past? Is that the job of our institutions? Or is it to bring Judaism to people? I said this before at my first Shabbat, but I think it's worth saying again. In the ark behind me, as many of you know, there's a Torah. There's a very special Sefer Torah. And that Torah was brought here by our founding members. It was brought here from the shores of Europe, saved from the Shoah. And it sits here in this ark, and we read it on special holidays and occasions. But the truth is, that the Torah wasn't in that scroll alone. It was in that group of survivors. Those people, after facing destruction and hatred, after witnessing the worst in humanity, came to these shores and looked for a place and a way to build a new Jewish future, to pass those traditions on to the next generation. The Torah that they saved was not in that scroll alone. It was in them, in their children, and in grandchildren, and everyone that has been a part of this sacred community since its founding, who's found connection and meaning. So that's what we're here to do. That is my hope and my vision. That is my goal, is to ensure that that Torah that they carried with them to these shores to build this house of Torah is not a Torah that lives in that ark, but lives in us. lives in the members of this community, lives in the people who are part of it. High holiday services are long. They're difficult to sit through. I know many rabbis and cantors, many people who complain that this generation just doesn't know how to sit like the previous ones. Right? What's wrong with them? But I can tell you one rabbi, Rabbi Moses ben Maimon, Maimonides, the Rambam, a long time ago, he noticed that 1,000 years ago, that people aren't really sitting very quietly through services. It's not a recent problem. And he had a very novel solution compared to the solution I hear many rabbis today. Today, there are many rabbis who want to know what's wrong with our congregants. What's wrong with this generation? Why can't they sit still and sit through a service? The Rambam asks what's wrong with our service. For more than 1,000 years, it was established halakha to do certain additions to include them. But he looked at the service and he cut some of those out to not burden the community. Because he recognized that the Judaism of 1,000 years before him didn't have to be the exact same Judaism that he taught and that he preached, that he shared. It was linked to that. But he wanted that Judaism to live inside people. And so 1,000 years later, I think that should be our goal as well. But many rabbis don't ask, what can we change in the service? They ask, how do we change the people? My goal this year is very simple. To not preserve Torah for the sake of preservation alone, in a vacuum, but to help you to live it. If you're somebody who wants a daily minyan and wants to be a part of helping to make that happen, you want to learn more about kashrut, you want to learn about Shabbat observance, I'm here to be your tour guide, to help you to walk that path and that journey and find that in our tradition. If you're somebody who wants to look out into the world, to Jewish values and to incorporate them into your lives, as a sibling, as a parent, as a child, as a friend, as a caregiver, in your community, in your occupations, as a healer or a lawyer or whatever else you might do. If you're someone who wants to bring Judaism out into the world to help the local community or to fight for people who are being oppressed on the other side of the earth, I'm here to help you make that connection, to show you the parts of our tradition that speak to you. Because that's where I want our Torah to live. Not in the ark, but in each and every member of this sacred community. As I conclude today, I think about those two jokes and that balance of preserving traditions for the sake of tradition. Of the rabbi who thinks that there's nothing more Judaism has to share with the world than Shabbat and kashrut. And I want to tell you, there's so much more to it than that. When I look at tomorrow's Parsha, we read the story of the Akedah of Abraham, who is so certain he was right, so certain he knew what God wanted of him, that he raised a knife in the air and almost destroyed the next generation, almost ensured that the Jewish people began and ended with him alone. Because he was certain that God wanted it one way and no other way. This is what God wanted. I'm not certain that I have a solution that's going to work. I'm not certain that the conservative movement down the line might become the great movement it once was, of rabbis and leaders of communities that stood for finding the best in modernity and in tradition and bringing them together. I don't know that that's the way to success and to a future. But I'm very afraid of those who are certain that there's only one way to do something. Those who are so certain that if people don't want to do things this way, don't want to participate in this way, don't want to connect in this way, that this is the only Judaism worth offering and the only one we're willing to offer. And if they don't want it, they can get out. Because I see them like Abraham, ready to sacrifice the next generation, because they think they know what God wants with certainty. As I said, I don't know for certain. But what I do know is that together we can explore what our tradition has to offer. Together we can look back on these last 60 years of this house of Torah, this community, the foundation that some of you helped to build, that some of your parents and grandparents helped to create. That we can build on that foundation a strong future for many years to come. As we look to this new year, we look to each other for help and for hope, for strength in this task and in our lives. Shana Tova.